Speak the charm of make, charm of make, charm of make, charm.
There will come a time on the planet Earth when science and technology will be long forgotten. When wizards will rule the world.
This is the Arnemancy Podcast. Join your host, Reverend Eric, and his diverse array of amazing guests in an exploration of tarot, magic, the occult, and the history of Western esotericism. The Arnemancy Podcast exists thanks to the support of generous listeners like you. Please consider supporting this podcast for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/Arnemancy. We're welcoming back to the show Jacob Budenz, who was on a few months ago discussing writing and some cool historical work, and we started to talk about kind of like the intersection of creativity and magic, but didn't quite have enough time to get into it as much as we wanted. So I will introduce Jacob again. Jacob Budenz is a queer author, multi-disciplinary performer, educator, and witch with an MFA from University of New Orleans and a BA from Johns Hopkins, whose work focuses broadly on the intersection of otherness and the otherworldly. Jake is the front person for Baltimore-based psychedelic witchpop darlings Moth Broth and has received awards and accolades for original theater work, including a new adaptation of Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master of Margarita and an original cabaret play about immortality and the cultural icon of the witch, Scythe, a dream baby cabaret. Jake, welcome back.
Hello, it is I, the whore of Babylon, and I have returned to terrorize your listeners.
I feel like they deserve it. No, I love my listeners, and I especially love getting the opportunity to introduce them to fun ideas and strange creativity, because I think that one of the things I love about the way you talk about your work is that you have a beautiful understanding of how magic and creativity are kind of like the same thing. Mm-hmm. And especially with my audience, I know that a lot of us are way into like grimoires and all this stuff that's like been written down. And there's this horrible human tendency to be like, oh, things are written down, this is how it is. And creativity just flies out the window. Mm-hmm. But why make the weird boring like that?
I agree. I mean, honestly, I say this a lot, but art is how I came to identify as a witch. And of course, I started identifying that way, and I had some esoteric things that I was interested in before that became the case. But honestly, realizing basically that an artist is a witch is what sort of opened me up to the whole world of the occult in like a more meaningful way. So I think I might have mentioned this on the last episode, but like I have an altar, I have my practices that are very private to me, but my original act of witchcraft and magic, it was public performance and writing as an act of divination and all of this kind of stuff. So to me, like, I don't want to force artists into the label of witch if they are freaked out by that. But to me, all artists really are witches if they choose to claim that. And so once you open yourself up to that, then you open yourself up to, you know, getting into the traditions and practices that you're talking about, perhaps. So these things have always been like so unified for me.
Yeah, I feel like even the description you gave made me think of like how art sort of embodies meaning, and what really has more meaning than our relationship with the world. And what's better at exploring that than like witchcraft, magic, right? Like it's kind of all about looking at the world and treating it not necessarily like something to be measured and dissected, but something to be like played in, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's
molded, if you will.
Yeah, splashed.
Definitely. People who attended my last performance as my solo cabaret act were probably splashed. I covered myself. I wore this like crazy, is actually kind of I think a recreation of a piece from a film, but like this cloak with these big red hands on it. And then underneath I was like shirtless and covered in fake blood. And I had, before I started singing, a bunch of blood in my mouth, and I just like let it like leak down. So I think the world was truly splashed by my last performance. And I had a little too much to drink before it, so I was a little splashed as well.
Does Baltimore do okay with you? Is Baltimore sort of ready for you? Like, are there times when you step outside and you're sort of like, oh, this poor city, it doesn't know what's about to happen?
Yeah, it's interesting because I moved here in 2010. I've been sort of active as an artist here really since 2012 because I was in school at the time that I moved here. And it's interesting because I did sort of come of age in a much more, I would say, avant-garde version of what the art scene is now. There was at the time a much more thriving theater and performance art scene, and theater as in the experimental DIY, like there were all these like crazy warehouse spaces that, recent MICA graduates would just take over with like swaths of crazy cloth and yarn and turn into like installations, and you do a play there or a performance there or whatever. So the scene, I think, used to be really, really avant-garde. And it's not to say that that spirit doesn't exist, but a lot of those spaces don't really exist anymore. I think across the country, probably even more personal to people on the West Coast, but like after the sort of those ship fire closures and stuff, like a lot of, I think, really avant-garde art across the country kind of not died out, but had less space because you can't make as ambitious work when you have to pay out the ass for rental fees. So, so now, I mean, I didn't used to be the weirdest or one of the weirder artists in Baltimore. I don't necessarily think of all of my work as outsider art, but I think definitely the scene has trended a little bit more normal or a little bit more of a sanitized, I would say, kind of like indie pop sensibility, which is fine. But yeah, I my bandmates and I, especially the co-founder and I talk about this a lot, where we like came of age in a much freakier scene, and now we're kind of the freaky scene a lot of the times, I think.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. Portland, I think, is sort of notorious for having lost a lot of that kind of sort of punk grunge aesthetic. The cost of living here has skyrocketed, and there are far fewer performance spaces and that kind of stuff. It's I mean, honestly, the internet is a saving grace for strange music and unusual expressions of art. Like without it, I don't know how musicians would manage to survive. I mean, not musicians, but cool musicians.
Yeah, the freaks.
So I do want to, before we get too deep into this, I feel like it's very possible that Moth Broth, your psychedelic witch pop darling band, has some cool news to share.
Yeah, so we just put out the first single from our forthcoming record. The title of the record is still under debate, but the single is called Willa. We put it out on Bandcamp a couple months ago, and we'll be releasing it on streaming services pretty soon, along with a remix from Shushu, the queer indie pop legends, which is really, really awesome and exciting for us. We have a music video coming out too. It's a very, I like to call it was extremely DIY, zero budget kind of scary basement music video that I like to refer to as a sort of gay Blair Witch Project type of a vibe.
I love it. That sounds really exciting. Congratulations too.
Thanks.
I mean, getting the Shushu remix, that's really big news. That's so cool. I hope to see you filling stadiums before long. Splashing stadiums.
Splashing. Well, yes, the juices will be flowing, hopefully, whether it's a stadium or a weird little theater. By the juices,
maybe a nationwide tour.
Yeah, well, we are trying to. We're hooking up kind of a mini tour for the end of the summer, which could be 3 cities or 6 cities or 10 cities, and then when we put our full LP out, we definitely are planning on touring. We've never toured as a band because our first album came out kind of, we got it, our label picked it up right after the Omicron variant emerged, when we had all thought like, oh, COVID is like pretty much over. in terms of ruining our lives. And then there was a month and a half where we were like, oh, it's kind of not. So we kind of didn't end up planning a tour around that time because we just thought like, oh, well, there's going to be another variant and then all that work is going to be kind of destroyed. So, yeah, so we're excited. We're doing kind of a mini tour to kind of hype the single and video. And then hopefully when the LP comes out, we'll be able to take some significant chunk of time off. 2 of us work in academia, so it'll probably be a summer tour or a winter tour.
Nice. I want to take a moment to just say how bizarre it is that we live in a world where you can say something like the Omicron variant emerged so casually when it sounds like the Decepticons invaded and like destroyed a city or something like that. I mean, I know it was bad, but it's still sort of like, those are some weird words to put together.
Totally. We're living in the Matrix, baby.
What we are going to get into, I can't remember if I announced this already. I probably did. I had to redo the intro like 5 times as I fumbled over all of my words. I really want to hear your thoughts and some stuff about your practice when it comes to sort of the intersection of witchcraft and creativity. In particular, because you've done so much, you know, like all of the writing you've done, the poetry you've put out, the music that you've been making, like it's a baffling array of stuff, especially considering the amount of time you spent in like formal academia, getting like lots of formal degrees from universities with really, really boring names. Like how did that happen? How did you pop out of there and be like, time to get weird? Like what drove you originally, do you think?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. When I started at Hopkins, I was pre-law. I love to tell people this, and they're like, what?
You were pre-law?
Yeah, it turns out, well, in high school, I was like in speech and debate and mock trial, and I was good at it. If you can believe it, I was like really good at a particular type of formal argumentation. And I kind of realized pretty quickly into college that what I was attracted to about law was like 80% the theatrics of litigation and about 20% like I like research and I find intellectual property law like interesting enough. But
That's something we should probably talk about some other time because I've worked in IP law.
No
also.
way. Yeah, well, maybe the next time we do an episode together, it'll be about how lawyers are actually maybe fae people.
So
right?
here's
I
the
read something
thing
about that.
Yeah, but like here's the thing that's really interesting about lawyers who are good at their work is that they're not necessarily good at rules as much as they are good at creatively breaking them. Right? Like there's definitely a thing about lawyers that is sort of like, these rules aren't necessarily keeping us in line as much as they are giving me power.
Oh, for sure. Well, that's the Fae, right? I mean, well, there are rules in place, but it's all about exploiting the rules and finding clever ways to talk around the rules and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's very, very true. So then, like, your BA was... So you were... Is that why you were at Johns Hopkins?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I studied writing, and Spanish was my second major. Don't ask me to speak quickly in Spanish anymore. I used to be fluent, and I use it in the sense that I have taught The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. That's what I like to say. I'm like, this is how I use my Spanish degree. I teach one Spanish book translated into English. But yeah, so, you know, I studied liberal arts stuff at Hopkins. They have a surprisingly robust and well-ranked, et cetera, like some liberal arts programs. And then my MFA formally was in creative writing, but it really was, what it came down to with an MFA was I want to teach college, and an MFA is terminal for that, and the choice to pursue it in fiction as opposed to, say, like opera or like multidisciplinary intermedia art or whatever was just kind of like, it felt, fiction was my first kind of medium, and it felt also in a way kind of like the most practical thing to spend a lot of time on, because I hate, this is very cliche to say, but in a way, like all my art is storytelling in a way. And so like, I felt like, oh, well, this is the one thing that really spending time breaking down the nuts and bolts of it will really kind of affect all of my other work in a way that like if I studied vocal performance as an MFA, I don't think it would be that useful for me as a poet, for example. So yeah, and if anyone's listening that's thinking about an MFA, don't do it if you have to take out loans for it. Do it if it's fully funded or if you've saved up the money for it. But if you are thinking of doing it and you can hook it up that way, it can be really great. University of New Orleans was a great program in terms of like they have really great scholarships, and then they have pretty good TA-ships and stuff. So I think I paid $7,000 out of pocket for my master's, and then the rest was fully funded with like scholarships and stuff. So I did really get some formal education and in the arts, and I'm actually considering getting a master's in counseling psychology, which is it's really far off the path, but I like school.
Though, I feel like it's not really that far off the path for a witch or a magician, right? Because one of the things that we end up doing a lot is talking to people, divination, help. You know, I mean, people come to us weird ass. I don't know what to describe us as, but you know, people want help all the time.
Yeah, for sure. Healers. Yeah. I mean, it's
healers.
I'm very obvious. If this wasn't clear from the last interview, I'm very resonant with like the high priestess energy. And to me, that's very like a lot of witches, especially who do divination and stuff. I feel like that energy of, you know, therapy, you're listening to somebody else talk. Divination, you're listening to what the cards or the runes or
but you also listen to the querent, you know.
Totally.
I mean, there's a lot of kind of back and forth, you know, that back and forth energy is really important, I think, with divination and stuff. So your poetry work, you know, you've described a lot about that, but the other thing that I think is really surprising about it is when your poetry meets its presentation to the public, like you really have a huge kind of almost like performance art thing going on where your poetry isn't necessarily, I mean, maybe I've never seen one of your performances since I am, you know, on the other coast, but it sounds like your poetry is probably best experienced in performance even.
Yes, I think so. And I published some of it. I mean, it's interesting, like when you have a kind of parallel sort of publishing side of your writing practice, when I write poems and I feel excited about them, they either fall into the primary category of like, oh, this is for the page, this is for the stage, if you will. A handful of them are for both. I mean, most of the poetry that I publish, it's still meant to be read out loud and performed, and the sounds are really important. Not all poets in the 21st century care as much about sound. A lot of us still do, not necessarily rhyming, but other kinds of ways of playing with sound. And so, yeah, I mean, for me, poetry is the most live wire sort of magical practice of my work in terms of, poetry is incantatory in nature. It is, you know, the reverse of that is like a lot of spells are poems. But free verse poetry can be... A lot
of them are really horrible poems.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And a lot of witches will be like, I respect it. They're like, the point isn't a beautiful poem. It's to create something that's easy to remember and easy to say and all that kind of stuff. But when I present poetry live, it's usually with my solo act, Dream Baby, which is, for lack of a better term, a bit culty. Sometimes it's more theatrical, like I'll MC kind of cabaret or salon style shows. But if I really have my way, I'm in a fairly small room full of people when I'm lucky. I really like an intimate space with that project, and in the kind of room where people are there to engage and listen, as opposed to I never book this act if I can avoid it at like bars or big music venues, because people are at music shows also to see and be seen and whatever. So I like to do it in theater spaces or galleries, and usually a set Baltimore likes 35-minute sets, so it's usually like most of the music is covers. I have a few of my own songs that I play. It's all very heavily stylized in a kind of like clangy, I don't want to say Diamanda Galassi, but that's the closest kind of touchstone, kind of like I'm banging on the piano. The singing is very haunted house, operatic kind of singing, and then prior to each song, there's like sort of a companion poem, and threaded through this, if I really have time to spread my wings, I'm also like talking about what the moon is doing and what the cosmos are doing and what like cosmic events are around the show and how they can kind of become points of ritual catharsis for the audience. And sometimes if it's the kind of gig where I'm like headlining or people are there to see me, a lot of times I'll do participatory rituals, really simple stuff. Like on the winter solstice, I did a performance where I dressed almost exactly traditional high priestess, like flowy caftan and blue robe, and I didn't have any pomegranates.
Lots of crescents.
Yeah, lots of crescents and candles, and I dragged in a big pink IKEA bag full of heavy stones that I collected at a park earlier that day. Oh, wow. And I was like singing, and I put them sort of in a semicircle around where I was performing, and then I did my like poetry and music thing, but before there were sort of 3 parts of the performance and 3 candles, and each candle represented like different things that people might be dealing with, and different like, okay, here's the time where you think of like what your burdens are, and here's the time where you think of like what is outside of your control in the world that you wish you could affect, or at least, you know, release its effect on you, and then here's like what you want for the next season. And it was one of my favorite performances ever. I mean, people were like crying, and I was crying, and so if I really get my way, I do stuff like that. But at other kinds of gigs, I will always, with this act, I will always like integrate poetry alongside of the music as a separate practice. It's like the poem is a separate piece. Yeah.
Well, I'm listening to you talk about this, and it totally sounds like the writing of the poem, or the writing of the act, or the design of the act, and everything. That it's spellcraft. Like you have fully sort of integrated that together into like a magical act. Like your performances are ritual.
Yeah, for sure. All of them. I mean, every single one. Even like, if I know that I'm going to be playing for, let's say, like a less witchy crowd or a less interactive crowd, for me, when I construct sets for this act, it's still always, what is the ritual for me? Like, what am I? So, like, I will just sometimes publicly release my own demons or deal with my own demons in front of people. And that's still, even at normal, sort of more normal shows, the conceit of the act is like, I'm a pretty even-tempered person off the stage, and then when you see me get up on stage and I'm like howling into the void and flipping out, but also singing with well-controlled vibrato, then it's like I sort of encourage people to, even in the more normal shows, to be like, I am up here being a wild freak, so that if you have stuff that you're carrying that's too freaky, you understand, like, it's okay to, I don't know, let that out. And even if you just let it out right now and release it. And so even that is a spell. Like, even the least witchy shows are like, in a way, I'm inviting people to engage in kind of ritual catharsis. If I at my best.
That the high priestess thing that you brought up earlier, it almost you're almost taking on the role of, you know, a folk healer or a clergy person as performer. I guess when you really abstract it, like the difference between mass and one of your performances is that you get to write the script.
Yeah. And no one has to believe in any god. I'll talk about occasionally some of the entities I'm interested in at the time. Not interested, I'm working with, that I think will interest people. But it's never like, when I talk about them, I always talk about them sort of as cultural archetypes, or like things that we have lessons to learn from. Like Scylla, since I last saw you, I got a tattoo of Scylla. But for example, like at this show that I'm referring to, there was a portion of the show where I talked about, like, I don't know, Scylla was turned into a monster out of jealousy and then written off as sort of like a notch in Odysseus's hero journey. And I sort of talked about that energy of like someone who hurts you and then treats you like you're a part of their hero's journey or whatever after the fact is like a so stuff like that. Like I'll talk about real entities that I'm working with and have a relationship with, but I'm just like, let me talk about the myth of this character, and hopefully something in it like connects to what you're experiencing. But yeah, I appreciate you talking about it as folk healing, because I get a little bashful. I do say sometimes like it can be a little culty. But then next week I'm doing a show where I'm just like emceeing and doing silly stuff, and that's kind of witchy, and like that's a spell too, but it's like a chiller, kind of more fun witchy performative vibe than like I only bust out the Pussy Moon Priestess like a couple times a year.
Yeah, I mean, I know that feeling. I do a number of public things too, but like there's this local group that I am part of called Hocus, the Hermetic Order of Clandestine Urban Scribes. Cool. And it's a literary reading series, but we have dressed it up like it's an ancient secret society. So I wrote all the like the ritual for it, like the opening and closing rituals, and sort of based them on actual secret society rituals. And when I go, I kind of take it seriously, but I don't think anybody else who's running the group really does. They're writers, and they're writing literature, because apparently literature is a genre, which I don't totally buy. But yeah, so I kind of know what that's like. You sometimes in public don't get to totally witch out as honestly as you want to, and it's probably absolutely because the public has a very poor history of dealing with witches. Right. Or like a very trendy notion, a very like light as a feather, stiff as a board notion of what it is to be a witch. And like you can, in some contexts, I think it's fine to kind of play into that a little bit and be tongue in cheek about that kind of vibe. So for sure. I have work that's, well, all of my work is spellcraft, but I have work that is ostensibly like less ritualistic in nature and more like kind of playing off of that. Like I would say my band, for me, it's still, I feel like when I perform, I'm still a conduit for something else outside of me. But the conceit of that project is more like we're making weird, whimsical music about myth and esoterica and things like that, and like we're I'm not trying to like convert anyone to the gospel of Scylla at Moth Broth shows, although I am very into trying to convert people to the gospel of the Christian mystics Julian of Norwitch and Marjorie Kemp, who I'm really obsessed with and who we have sort of a lesbian fan fiction song about. And I'm like, I will utilize my liberal arts seminar education if it kills me. And it is to talk about how these two obscure medieval women are actually really punk and probably kind of gay, and you should probably think about them. So even with that project, I don't know anything about them. Can you give me the elevator pitch, the lesbian mystic elevator pitch? Reverend Eric, I would love to. Please, unload it. So Julian of Norwitch was an anchoress, which means, for the listeners at home, she was a holy woman whose job it was to live basically in a wall and interact with nobody unless she was offering spiritual advice. And it was more a position of men, but there were women that could do this. It is believed that really her family put her into this because it was during the bubonic plague and they thought maybe she'd be a little safer this way. But yeah, so she lived in a wall. She had visions allegedly from God. Frankly, from a theological perspective in the 21st century, some of those visions are still pretty queer and proto-feminist in a lot of ways. Like it's very
She talks about Jesus as like a mother. There's like a lot of weird gender stuff going on. She and Marjorie Kemp actually both relate to the devil in a very like traditionally masculine way, which is that in both of their accounts of the devil, they are tempted by the devil and not like possessed or raped by a demon, which is usually what happened to women allegedly. She's pretty interesting. And then her like total foil, Marjorie Kemp, was a woman who had 12 children, probably suffered a postpartum psychotic break, and started having visions where God told her she was not allowed to have sex with any more men because she had to get remarried to Jesus and or God the Father, and also travel all over the place without her husband on holy pilgrimages, and occasionally not eat meat.
My pearls.
Yeah.
A woman traveling alone?
Yes, it was pretty radical. And the most important thing about Marjorie, from my perspective as a Cancer, is that she was very well known for showing up at holy sites and crying so hysterically and disruptively that even the holiest people around her were like, bitch, shut up, you are crying too much. And she's just like, the world is just so sinful and we all destroyed Jesus, and she's like so overcome all the time. And I'm like, I do kind of relate to that. And she and Julian of Norwitch, according to Marjorie Kemp's autobiography, did meet, and they did really hit it off. And they
did they become roommates?
They some of the words that she used, I want to say that they dallied together. I'm pretty sure. Don't quote me on this, medieval scholars. I'm pretty sure they dallied, and I'm pretty sure that they were common to one another. And both of those expressions occasionally carried some interesting connotations. The other thing to know about Marjorie Kemp is that she was extremely horny. She was constantly having visions about how
she had 12 kids.
12 kids. And
yeah, that's in an era when infant mortality was that high.
Yeah.
Like that's yeah.
And you can also imagine why you would be put through that, because women weren't allowed to say no to their husbands. So you can also imagine, like, after your 12th kid, you were like, honey, God is telling me I cannot do this to my body anymore. She was pretty cool. She also was always having visions about how Jesus is so hot. And eventually God told her she was getting married to God the Father instead of Jesus. And she was disappointed because she was sexually attracted to Jesus. And her temptation by the devil, I kid you not, I want to do a dramatic reading of it at one of Moth Broth's shows. Jason and Greg won't let me. But she has a temptation from the devil where he shows her a long line of men of, quote, diverse races and religions, more or less, exposing their penises to her. And the devil is like, ha ha ha, I can see that you like it. And the follow-up was like, and she had to admit that she did. I'm paraphrasing, of course. This is all in Middle English and like much more elegant. But she was extremely horny. I'm obsessed with her. She was horny and she cried a lot. And I'm like, I really relate to you, girl. Like
that tale of the devil temptation reminds me of a thing from Norse mythology. And I'm not going to remember the names of anything, but there's a goddess who was wronged by the gods, and so they were like, all right, to make up for this, you can marry one of our fine Viking bachelor gods, but you have to pick them out by their legs alone. So they basically all the single gods like lined up behind this screen so that she could only see their legs. And she was like, she really wanted Thor. Right. So she's like, all right, I'm going to pick the most muscular legs. And so she went down the line, found the best legs, picked that god. And it wasn't Thor. It ended up being like the god of skiing.
Oh, my God. Well, not a bad consolation prize, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I bet they probably had some great vacations.
Totally. And great, like meaty thighs. Sign me up, girl. I completely understand. The god of skiing. I'm obsessed with that. I would just like to state for the record that if anyone listening to this podcast is a deity of skiing and is single, reach out.
I will encode your phone number in the show notes somehow that only a god of skiing would be able to figure out.
Totally.
Okay, yeah. Well, heck, I don't even know how to follow up that conversation.
I was going to say, I got us pretty far from, well, the Christian mystics are witches to me as well, so it's not so far away from the original topic.
Well, I mean, honestly, the witches of Europe, I mean, all of them were probably Christian.
I mean, definitely. And the Christian women of Europe, all witches. No.
But I mean, we can see from the stuff that survived, like the material we have, like the books of witchcraft and all that kind of stuff, like it's filled with Jesus prayers and all that kind of stuff.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
The majority of grimoire magic is Christian.
100%.
Or Muslim. I mean, it's... or Jewish, I guess.
I've been really into the Book of Oberon lately. Which is, what a thing to say on a podcast, guys. I'm so into the Book of Oberon right now. And a lot of it is, there's a whole Theurgia section, which is pretty cool. A lot of it is like total god magic, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, I will admit that I have not read the Book of Oberon. There are gaps in my reading. It's
not really something to read. It's kind of something to get gifted by a friend because it's kind of expensive to buy for yourself. And it's kind of just something to open up and vibe with. It's like more of a source book. Oh God, I'm going to get struck by lightning for recommending the Book of Oberon on a podcast. There's some pretty dark stuff in there, but it is a really interesting study of like Elizabethan magic.
I don't think you'll get struck by lightning for that. I mean, you'll be fine. I'm pretty sure you'll be fine.
Thanks. If it was going to happen, I mean, I haven't done a performance art piece about tongue speaking yet, which was a part of my very early history. Like when I was too young to remember, but I think the day
Pentecostal style.
Oh baby, there were hands laid on my mom's pregnant belly when I was in the womb, kind of stuff. With like,
and look what happened.
I know it all worked on me. I did grow up to be a holy woman of sorts, but not the it works.
Heck, maybe you were a changeling. Who even knows?
Honestly, Reverend Eric, I would not be surprised. It would explain a lot.
I wonder, there's that old legend about people being born with a caul, like, the hood. You never hear about that anymore. I wonder how many people actually have that and like just, they get born in a hospital, a doctor gets rid of it and nobody ever says anything about it.
Wait, tell me about this. Born with it's like there's something.
It's something like part of the amniotic sac is like still attached to the baby's head, so it looks like they're kind of born with a hood or something like that. I don't know the details, but it used to sort of, people who were babies who were born that way were kind of thought to be like touched by the fae, or we're going to grow up to be wizards or something. I don't know all of the legend, but you'll come across it every once in a while in folklore.
I gotta ask my parents about that. I mean, I'm the third child, so they don't even remember what time I was born, which is, so I'll never know if my rising sign
third
is
of 12
truly...
or...
No, yeah, exactly. I was the 12th child that caused my mother to lose it and start having visions from God. That was me. That was that child.
Everything is becoming clear now.
Yeah. I was the last one. I was the final of 3. So they were just over it. I will never know. They were pretty roughly sure. I'll never know if I'm a Cancer rising or a Leo rising, which is infuriating to my astrologer friends because I don't know what my houses are. I don't know. It's hard to say, but and Pennsylvania doesn't do I bought my birth certificate to see if it would have the time on it, and it didn't. So
and it doesn't.
It's a mystery.
Oh.
Yeah, my cat too. I don't know when she was born, so I'll never be able to read her star chart.
Your cat?
Yeah, they don't know what day.
Not even what day.
They think it was. They say estimate September 1st, which could mean anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I never really thought about the astrology of my cats. They're all passed away at this point, but one of them was very friendly and loving, and the other one was a violent monster. So one of them must have been ruled by Mars.
One of them had a Scorpio moon. No.
Yeah. All right, so let's see. So your creative process, when you are working on this stuff, when you're working on poetry, do you see the performance of the poem as you are working on it? Like, is that something that comes into it, or do you kind of attach that later?
Later, when I write poetry, I hate to put it this way because it's so cheesy, but it's almost a lot of the time, like 80% of the time, it's like touching a live wire, where especially at times where I'm really creatively productive and writing a lot of poetry, I don't even remember, like I'll open my journal because I've finally gotten into the habit of dating things, which is helpful. But sometimes I'll open my journal and I'm like, what the fuck? Like, who was that? It's my handwriting, or what was going on. And so I've started dating poetry. I would say the most mystical aspect of my poetic, and to an extent my fiction process, is that it's pretty divinatory in a lot of ways. Like, there are images that will show up in poems that I have no rational reason for having included in my poems that will show up later in my life in kind of bizarre ways, and I will forget about having written. And so when I sit down to write a poem, there's very little about where it'll end up that I'm really thinking about. That goes as well for what it's going to look like on the page, because I like to play with shapes in poetry, and there's no real way when you're handwriting a poem to know exactly how long lines are going to be. So I guess when I'm writing a poem, I am thinking always about how it's going to sound out loud, because I just break lines based on where, this is a very unscientific first draft process, but I break up lines based on where I think there should be a pause in the middle of a sentence, or where I think the one word coming after a word is going to be a surprise, which is really rudimentary way of talking about like enjambment and stuff like that. So that's like the only thing about the future of the poem that I'm thinking about is I'm pretty sure that I will want a pause here, or I'm pretty sure that these two words should be broken up because the second word will be more impactful if it's at the beginning of the next line or next stanza. And then basically I kind of write a poem and then I forget about it for a while. And then the next time I'm like, have some unstructured creative time, I'll just sift through my journal and find poems to type up, and then I'll kind of decide from there what's going to happen to them. And so I think usually I can tell at the end of writing a poem that I'm going to want to return to it for sure, and I'll put a little star on the side of the page on the top next to the date to be like, okay, I've been writing a lot of poems this week, but like this one I think I'm really going to do something with. But that's about it. I think when I type it up, I will say sometimes I write poems that are much more directly expressive about feelings, and I'm usually pretty sure those will be integrated into performance because it's hard to publish poems that are really direct about a feeling. But it is easy to integrate that into part of a greater whole in a performance in a way that adds to it. I'll give you an example. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I'll give you an example.
No, keep going. This is fascinating. I'm envious of poets. I have never been able to get that sort of sense of freedom with writing to feel like I'm actually writing poetry in a way that is worth keeping around.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. It took me a really long time too. I was really interested in formal poetry when I was very young, and you kind of can't publish formal poetry anymore, and that was really confusing to me to learn when I got to college. And so it took me, I was probably after college, even though I took poetry classes in college, that I kind of found my way with it. But an example of something I was pretty sure if I used it for anything, it would be for a performance, is something that I have been performing. I've performed it a couple times, where it's a haibun, which is basically a big chunk of text, like a prose poem with
haibun,
Haibun. And then so there's like a big chunk of text that's a prose poem, and then there's a break, and then the next stanza is a haiku, and that's the end. And I sort of knew when I was writing this that I probably wasn't going to publish it. I have feelings about publishing haikus and haibuns as like a white person. I criticize anyone else for doing it, but like it's not my vibe, I think, to like ape, that style for publishing. But so I sort of knew that poem, if I did anything with it, which I wasn't sure I was going to do, would be for performance. And so I've repurposed it as a spoken, where I recorded myself reading it to a backing track of a cover of Cocoon by Bjork that I perform. And in a way that I think adds, because the song Cocoon is not necessarily about, well, in my opinion, it's about gray areas of consent in a really loving romantic relationship. And the poem itself is kind of about like lack of consent in committed relationships. And so it, in a way, it sort of recontextualizes Bjork's song with this like spoken word poem, but some of the heavier stuff in the poem gets buried under times where I'm like singing very loudly. And that's kind of the point of it too, is like, you can't hear the entire text, or you get like one thing is distracting the other and they're kind of talking to each other, but so your ear is pulled in both directions. So I do stuff like that, where sometimes I'm like, well, I could never publish a poem that's this direct about something, but maybe down the line I can do something with it where I integrate it into a song somehow.
You also mentioned earlier about sort of this idea of imagery as you write poetry. Like you, like I'm sort of wondering if there's kind of a sense of creating an image in the reader's mind or in the listener's mind as the poem is experienced. Like, is that a thing that, yes, and that makes me think of kind of the tradition of image magic, or the sort of way of transferring some sort of like imaginal construct from the creator to the receiver. I'm wondering, is that something that kind of is that something that is maybe related to part of your poetry creation process or your creation process in general?
For sure. In both my poetry and my prose, I'm extremely image driven in a way that I think for prose can be a little bit cloying sometimes. I'm just obsessed with how things look and how it feels to look at them that way and things like that. And so as far as image magic and poetry goes specifically, I mean, absolutely. A lot of my poetry, whether it's for page or stage or both, just incorporates a lot of esoteric imagery. And when I'm incorporating that esoteric imagery, I am kind of incorporating whatever ritualistic objects I may or may not have in my house into the intention of the spell. So for instance, this is a really basic example. I haven't published this poem yet because it's pretty lewd. And so it's very, I mean,
that stops you, huh?
No, but it's even more prurient than a lot of, it's the kind of thing where I'm like, oh, if I publish this, I would have to consider maybe publishing it under a pen name for work reasons. Just because it's like, it's too, my students, when I teach classes, which I haven't been teaching classes as much, my students still do, they definitely Google me. I ask them not to Google me until after the class is over, and they do it anyway. And I'm like, this would be a real nightmare to talk to my students about. It's very much about sex. It's about fucking yourself, as a way of reclaiming power, but also fucking your life in a way. For instance, I start with the image of blue candles because the poem is pretty like, it's pretty sad. It's pretty much about like allowing yourself to be used and discarded. And then the turn of the poem, it's semi-sonnet structured in that it's 14 lines with a volta. It's not rhyming or anything, but the turn of the poem is that like, oh, it's sort of about the poetic process of self-destruction where you like try to make something beautiful and meaningful out of self-destructive behavior. And so it begins with the image of blue candles very subtly, which a lot of times blue is about like luck and good fortune or protection, or in some cases. And so it's like, I don't know, when I incorporate blue into my practice, a lot of times it's to make luck out of a difficult situation or like dumb luck. And so I do stuff like that in poems a lot where I'm like, oh, actually the spell of this poem is this. And I think about the colors and images that I choose based on like when I'm intentional about it and not just like touching the live wire of my crazed feelings. I think about like, oh, well, what am I trying to manifest and what images kind of enhance that. So yeah, in a word, that's a really long way of saying, yeah, I do engage in kind of image magic in my poetry, and I utilize a lot of esoteric imagery a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've thought about that sort of combination or the intersection of word and image magic a lot because, you know, we don't necessarily, I mean, we live in a society where we are constantly inundated with image, you know, television and video and all that kind of stuff. But we don't always have, you know, those sorts of images aren't the same kind as the images that are like painted in our imagination by words. Right. And I think that most people, including a lot of occultists and practitioners, aren't necessarily aware of the amount of power that kind of inducement of image has on others. Like, I think that's kind of one of the most gorgeous things about the intersection of creativity and magic is that we can do that. Like, and when we are aware of what we're doing, like it gives them like an additional level of sort of potency. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, mea culpa. Like I've had times in my life where I was identifying very much as a witch and making art that I would describe as kind of irresponsible in certain ways because I was kind of conjuring stuff that was, I don't want to say purposelessly dark, but stuff that I wasn't like really thinking ritually about how I would like tie it together into something that wasn't harmful to me or to other people. And I think like, I don't know, I think we touched on this really briefly in the last time we recorded together, where it was like, for a while I had this confused feeling of like, when I write poetry and bad things happen that seem consistent with this poem, like, am I manifesting that into my life, or like in opening myself up to outside forces, are they trying to warn me about something? And I like probably will never have an answer to that question. But I try to be more intentional about where poems go now, because I'm like, well, like, what if things ended nicely in this poem?
What?
Would that be good for me?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, yes, probably. So speaking of endings, I'm sort of wondering, like, now that you've got this incredible tattoo of Scylla, have you found your Charybdis?
No, to all.
And when is Fleet Week in Baltimore? Should they watch out?
No, not yet. I engage with Scylla on a personal level. And I will, this isn't quite a name drop because it's not someone who would remember me, but in 2016, I attended a pagan and neo-pagan conference that Ellen Lorenzi Prince was sort of the headliner for. She's really cool. I went to one of her things, and then I ended up going to all of her things that I could, because I was like obsessed with her. She was really into, at least at this conference, like the use of like sort of guided meditations for the creative process and the creative process for conjuring too. She was like amazing. But she has this tarot deck called the Dark Goddess tarot deck. She did not pay me to advertise this tarot deck. And I will say, like, artistically, like, her style is not necessarily what I resonate with for tarot. But the conceit of the deck is like, it's not a deck that you use all the time for your problems. It's like every so often, if you feel like you need help with something, you pull a card from the deck and you develop a relationship with the goddess that you pull. And she was very much like, these images are just for starter. Like, really what I want you to do is, if you resonate with it, like, find her on the internet and in books and develop a relationship with her that way. And so she did a workshop, like, where she showed people how to do this with her deck or with other similar decks that involve like entities. It really was like a workshop for entity, like, you know, encountering entities and working with them through something like this. And I pulled Scylla from her deck and had a really intense experience with it. It was one of the early non-church related, like, really intense spiritual experiences that somebody else was responsible for. Is like very powerful. And we all, you know, she let everybody keep the card that they pulled or whatever. And I still have the card that I pulled from that workshop, and it's still on my altar. And this was like 8 years ago. And so, so Scylla has been kind of like a protector goddess for me in a lot of ways, or monster, or protector, demigoddess, monster, what have you. Yeah.
And Scylla is sort of interesting in the context of that kind of like, you know, Greco-Egyptian stuff, because Scylla's like a daughter of Helios, and Helios has that association with the Agathos daimon, like the good god, the good spirit. Like that's sort of an interesting, sounds protectory for sure.
Super. I feel like now when I put my arm out, because this is also my first visible, like, tattoo that's visible with clothes on. Or like without, well, obviously you can see some of my other tattoos. The listeners at home do not know that I am wearing a very low cut jumpsuit. But this is my first tattoo that is visible on my arm. And I do kind of feel like the tentacles and tails unfurl when I am feeling freaked out about stuff. And like, I don't know. I love that I can talk to people about this.
Hey, that totally makes sense. You know, images, the imaginal world comes first, always. Yeah. Look, this is such a fascinating conversation. I feel like we could continue talking, but also we have to wrap up. Unfortunately, we're definitely going to have. I hope that we're going to have a little bit of your music available here.
Silver hair is fine as skin so fair it shines a pale inviting blue. I live alone out here, no neighbor to shush my warbling moans. No towns for days, just my clothes in the hay. No one was
can you tell the listeners where to experience some of your amazing work?
For sure. So at Dream Baby Jake on Instagram is where I am most up to date, at least about live performances or occasionally digitally available versions of performances. So that's like where to keep most up to date with my work. My book Tea Leaves is available wherever books are sold on the internet and in some bookstores. And if it's not in your favorite bookstore, you can ask them to order it. And then if you...
And have them order extra copies, right?
Right.
Put on the shelf.
Well, if one person asks a small bookstore to order a book, they usually order like 2 or 3. We don't make... by the way, I mean, when people buy my book, other than directly through me and my publisher, I make maybe 50 cents. So this is not a money thing. But
wait, you mean poets aren't all millionaires?
No, it's not a get rich quick scheme. It's a get poor long scheme. Yeah.
You heard it here first, folks.
So that's the thing. Yeah. So Tea Leaves is the name of my book. Dream Baby Jake on Instagram, and then Moth Broth Band on Instagram, all one word, or Moth Broth, my band, is on all the streaming things. Those are probably the best things. And if you like live performance and you live on the East Coast, come see me. I will, with consent...
Come to Baltimore. Bring a poncho.
Yes, I'll kiss your hand. Bring a poncho. Yes, the juices will flow. Don't sit in the splash zone if you don't want to get wet. Boys. I'm gonna get you in trouble. I'm sorry.
How are you gonna get me in trouble?
By saying gross prurient stuff on your podcast.
Hey, I don't have. I'm self. This podcast is self-published. I'm pretty sure it's marked as not for children on every major podcasting platform.
Well, you tell your agent that you're just protecting queer art.
I will. I am going to find an agent and tell them that.
Me too. And let me know how you do it.
All right. Thank you so much for coming back on my podcast. It's great to get to revisit the stuff and take a deeper dive into the splash zone and learn more about your creative process and your approach to all this stuff. And I look forward to hearing more Moth Broth.
Thank you so much. If this episode doesn't end up being called The Splash Zone, no, I'm just kidding.
That's it. I got it. The Splash Zone.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been another episode of the Arnemancy Podcast. Thank you for joining me. I have been your host, Reverend Eric. You can find Arnemancy online at arnemancy.com, and you can subscribe to this podcast anywhere podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting the Arnemancy Project for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/Arnemancy.
This is Vanessa Urena, and I'm really excited to announce my new store, Sword and Scythe, where I will be offering magical art, materia, and services beneath Mars and Saturn. You can visit the store at swordandscythe.com and be sure to sign up for the email list to receive early access to new releases.